The crack of bone against flesh rang out unnaturally in the pressurized cabin of the plane. Passengers gasped as Officer Garrett Kane, his face twisted with rage, stared at the woman he had just struck. She was dazzlingly beautiful, her voluptuous curves barely contained by a black silk lingerie-style dress adorned with white roses. And now she lay slumped against the window with a thin trail of blood running from her lip. Her crime, refusing, silently and firmly, to give up the seat she had paid for. Kane, emboldened by the authority of his badge and the arrogance of a man who had never been told no, believed he had simply put another defenseless civilian in her place. He had no idea he had just assaulted a federal agent, a woman trained to dismantle men like him from the inside. He thought it was over. For him, it had only just begun. Before discovering how she slowly destroys his life, comment from which part of the world you are watching us and subscribe so you do not miss a single moment of the justice that is coming. The recycled air of the Boeing hummed, a monotonous drone that usually lulled passengers into a state of placid boredom. For Celeste Voss, it was the sound of transition, the white noise between one life and another. For the past stretch of time she had been undercover, living a life of tenacity, lies, and constant vigilance. Now she was simply a woman flying home, wrapped in a black silk dress with a white rose print that clung to her generous curves, a marked contrast to the tactical gear she had stripped off only hours earlier. The window seat in first class was her small reward, a space to relax, to let the armor of her alias dissolve and become herself again. She rested her head against the cold acrylic, the sun a bright, searing white at high altitude. The first sign of trouble was a shadow falling over her. She did not open her eyes. She had learned to assess a presence by its energy long before seeing its face. This one was heavy, impatient, and overflowing with arrogance. "Excuse me," a male voice growled. It was deep, accustomed to being obeyed. Celeste opened her eyes slowly, her gaze calm and measured. He was a heavy-set man in his 30s, with a bulldog jaw and a cheap suit that screamed public servant on a limited budget. His closely cropped hair and the deep indentation in his belt, where a holster usually sat, marked him as law enforcement. "You're in my seat," he stated without asking. He held up his boarding pass as if it were a court order. Celeste looked at it, then at her own resting on the empty seat beside her. "I believe you're mistaken," she said in a soft, low voice, without a trace of challenge. "This is 2A. Your card says 3B. He frowned, narrowing his eyes as he really looked at her for the first time. He did not stop at her face. His gaze dropped, lingering on the curve of her chest beneath the thin silk, a dismissive, possessive glance that raised goosebumps on her skin. It was the look of a man who believed the world, and every woman in it, owed him something. "There's been a mix-up," he insisted, hardening his tone. "My back hurts. I need the legroom. You have to move." A flight attendant, a slightly disheveled woman named Marla, hurried over. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked. He produced a badge from his wallet with practiced speed. "Officer Garrett Kane, Charleston Police Department. The airline got my seat wrong. I need this one." Marla's professional smile faded. Police officers on planes were unpredictable. Some offered reassurance. Others became obstacles. She looked at Celeste, who offered her a slight, polite smile. "I'm sorry about your back officer," Celeste said, her tone still impassive. "But I reserved this seat months ago, and I'm not moving." Kane clenched his jaw. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a woman he had already categorized and dismissed. He saw the designer bag, the expensive dress, the flawless makeup, and decided she was just another spoiled woman who needed a lesson. "I wasn't asking," he growled, stepping closer and invading her space. "I'm telling you, get up." The air crackled. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, their quiet conversations faltering. Marla placed herself between them. "Sir, I can't ask another passenger to give up their seat. We can see if we can find you another option." He waved her off. "I'll handle this," he said, turning his full attention back to Celeste, his face darkening. "Last chance. Move." Celeste looked at him steadily without blinking, her dark eyes unwavering. Her facade of calm was perfect, a mask refined over years of facing men far more dangerous than this second-rate bully. Yet inside, something had shifted. The fatigue of her undercover operation faded, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. This man was not merely a nuisance, he was a type, the kind of man who used his badge as a shield to hide his own vileness, who saw power not as responsibility, but as a weapon. And he had chosen the wrong target. "No," she said. The word was quiet but final. It was the period at the end of a sentence he had not expected. For an instant, Kane looked stunned, as if he could not process the refusal. Then his face contorted into a mask of pure fury. It happened faster than anyone could react. His hand rose, not with an open palm to push, but with a closed fist. He did not hold back. He put his full weight behind it. The sound, a wet, nauseating crack, cut through the cabin's murmur. Celeste's head snapped sideways, striking the window with a dull thud. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Bright red blood, vivid against her brown skin, welled from her split lip. She slumped against the window, not unconscious, but momentarily stunned by the brutality of the act. Kane stood over her, breathing hard, fist still clenched. He looked at her not with regret, but with a flash of grim satisfaction, the look of a man who had finally restored order to his world. The silence that followed the blow was a dense, suffocating void. It lasted only a second before the cabin erupted in clamor. A man in seat 3A leapt to his feet. "Hey, what the hell is wrong with you?" Another passenger was already fumbling for his phone, the red recording light blinking in the dimness. Marla stared at Kane, mouth open in horror, her training momentarily abandoned. Kane seemed to regain his composure, swelling his chest as he fell back on his training. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted in the authoritative voice of a cop accustomed to intimidating suspects. The woman was defiant and aggressive. The lie was so brazen, so obvious, that it only fanned the outrage. Celeste pushed herself upright slowly, deliberately. She touched her split lip with her fingers, looked at the blood on the tips, then looked back at Kane. Her expression was the most terrifying thing in the cabin. There was no fear, no tears, no shock. Only a deep, chilling stillness, an unsettling calm more threatening than any scream. It was the calm of a tectonic plate settling just before the earthquake. Her mind, a precision instrument of observation and analysis, was already working. She was no longer a victim. She was an agent on a new, unauthorized mission. Her gaze swept the cabin, cataloging everything. The man in 3A, mid-40s, business suit, protective instinct, a potential witness. The teenager across the aisle with the phone, hoodie, wide eyes, capturing every second. Digital evidence. Marla, the flight attendant, already recovering, speaking urgently into the cabin phone, pale as death. Official report. Kane answered his own bravado. His initial swagger was already cracking, replaced by a defensive posture. He was realizing too late that this was not a street corner, where his word was law. "I am a law enforcement officer," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume would make it more convincing. "I was maintaining order." Celeste's voice cut through his bluster. "Marla," she said firmly and clearly, addressing the flight attendant. "Please ask the captain to radio ahead. I want the police waiting for this plane at the gate." She did not even look Kane as she spoke, a dismissal more profound than any insult. She was ignoring him completely, rendering him irrelevant. The request, so calm and routine, shifted the dynamic entirely. It was not a hysterical plea for help. It was an order, the sound of someone taking control. Kane's face flushed even redder. "Nobody gives orders here," he growled, taking a step toward her. Instantly, the man from 3A stepped into his path. "You touch her again, and I'll break your arm," he said in a low voice, trembling with anger. A second flight attendant, a tall, imposing man, planted himself firmly in the aisle. "Sir," he said to Kane in a firm voice, "return to your seat, or I will have you restrained." The threat of plastic cuffs, the supreme humiliation for a man like Kane, finally seemed to cool his fury. He glared at her one last time, a look full of venom, before turning and striding back toward economy, shouldering his way down the aisle. Celeste finally accepted the ice pack Marla offered, pressing it gently against her swollen lip. "Are you all right, miss? Do you need a doctor?" Marla asked in a shaky voice. "I'm fine," Celeste said, her gaze distant. "Make sure you get the names of everyone who saw it, especially the young man with the phone." She was no longer processing the pain. The pain was data, an indicator of injury, not a distraction. Her mind was a whirlwind of protocols: document, isolate, control. She could feel the pressure of the other passengers, a mixture of pity, admiration, and morbid curiosity. They saw a beautiful woman who had been assaulted. They did not see the predator staring back at them. The machinery, devastatingly efficient, was beginning to turn. Kane had made two mistakes. The first was putting his hands on her. The second, and far more serious, was letting her see his badge. He had given her his name, his department. He believed his authority was a shield. Celeste knew it was a leash, and she was about to yank it hard enough to snap his neck. For the rest of the flight, she remained silent, the ice pack pressed to her face, eyes closed. She was not resting. She was planning. She was building a timeline, creating a psychological profile, and mapping the first 5 steps in the systematic destruction of Officer Garrett Kane. He believed he had won a confrontation over a seat. He had no idea he had just declared war with the full backing of the United States government. The moment the plane's wheels touched the tarmac in Washington, D.C., Celeste's transformation was complete. The vulnerable woman in the silk dress had vanished, replaced by the cold efficiency of Special Agent Voss. As requested, 2 uniformed airport police officers were waiting at the jetway. They were young, professional, and slightly intimidated. When Celeste, despite her split lip and bruised cheek, took control of the situation with an authority that far exceeded theirs. She did not demand Kane's immediate arrest. That would be too simple, too messy. Having local police take custody of an officer from another jurisdiction was a guarantee of lost paperwork and professional courtesy failures. No, this required a more delicate and far more forceful approach. She gave a concise, objective statement. She provided the officers with contact information for the key witnesses she had identified, and calmly requested that a copy of the official incident report be sent to a specific high-level email address at the Department of Justice. The mention of the Justice Department, combined with her Settling serenity made the young officers straighten. They escorted a furious Kane off the plane for questioning, and Celeste was left alone in the quiet hum of the aircraft after deplaning. An hour later, she was in the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the J. Edgar Hoover building. The open offices were a hive of quiet, focused activity, a world apart from the chaos of the cabin. There she was, not a victim. She was one of the most respected agents in the counterterrorism division. She walked past agents who greeted her with a mixture of respect and caution. They knew her reputation: meticulous, relentless, with an almost supernatural ability to detect the cracks in any organization. Her supervisor, Deputy Director Harlan Reeves, a shrewd man with silver hair who had seen everything, took one look at her bruised face when she entered his glass-walled office. "I'm almost afraid to ask," he said in a dry, gravelly voice. "This wasn't in the debrief." Celeste sat across from his desk. The silk dress now looked strangely out of place among the symbols of federal power. "A Charleston police officer had an issue with my seat on the flight home," she said in a flat voice. He expressed his dissatisfaction physically. Reeves's gaze hardened. An assault on a civilian was one thing. Assaulting one of his own agents, even off duty, was an attack on the agency itself. "Give me his name." "Officer Garrett Kane," Celeste answered. "I'd like to request his departmental file and any sealed complaints against him. I'll need access to NCIC and the law enforcement officers killed and assaulted database to cross-reference." It was not a request. Reeves nodded as he typed on his terminal. "Done. What's your plan, Celeste?" That was the key question. He knew her. She was not simply seeking justice. She was a strategist. "He thinks he's untouchable," Celeste said, her gaze fixed on the city skyline beyond the window. "Men like him don't just break the rules. They believe the rules don't apply to them. An official FBI investigation right now would turn him into a martyr for some, a victim of an overzealous federal government. He'd hire lawyers, a wall of silence would go up, and it would become a procedural nightmare." Reeves leaned back, steepling his fingers. "So what then?" Celeste turned back to him, a glacial fire burning in her eyes. "I'm not going to use a hammer. I'm going to use a scalpel. I want to watch him destroy himself. His arrogance is his weakness. I'm going to give him enough rope to hang himself, his department, and anyone who has covered for him." Over the following hours, Celeste worked with unsettling concentration. The files Reeves had pulled painted a grim, predictable picture. Officer Garrett Kane had a long, troubled history of excessive force complaints, 14 in his 12-year career. Every case followed the same pattern: a confrontation with a civilian, usually a minority, followed by an escalation of violence that Kane invariably described as the force necessary to subdue a resisting suspect. And in every case, the complaint was dismissed: lack of evidence, conflicting testimony, uncooperative victim. It was a classic example of a corrupt system protecting its own. But Kane had never faced a victim like Celeste. She was not resisting, and she was about to create her own evidence. She reviewed the files, the dull ache of her bruised lip only sharpening her determination. She saw the names of his previous victims, the litany of their abuse. This was no longer just about a punch on a plane. It was about them. It was about the 14 complaints that went nowhere. She was not only going to get justice for herself, she was going to get it for all of them. The first step was not an attack, but a whisper. An anonymous seed of doubt perfectly planted that would find fertile ground in the paranoia of a guilty man. An anonymous email arrived in the inbox of the Charleston Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. It was sent from a highly encrypted, untraceable Proton Mail account, a ghost in the machine. The email was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity. It did not mention Celeste Voss by name, nor did it specifically reference the flight. Instead, it presented itself as a tip from a concerned citizen who had witnessed a pattern of troubling behavior by one of their officers. The language was precise, clinical, and contained just enough departmental jargon to suggest the sender was a fellow law enforcement officer, perhaps a disgruntled colleague. Subject: improper conduct. Officer G. Kane. That was how it began. The report described an officer who displayed extreme aggressiveness and little self-control in public, with a documented history of violent confrontations with civilians. It vaguely alluded to a recent incident during personal travel in which the officer's conduct was highly embarrassing to the institution and represented a significant legal liability for the city. The email concluded with a chillingly simple sentence: "There is video evidence. It would be a shame if it reached the media before the department had a chance to handle it internally." Celeste sat in a dark room at a secure FBI facility, a mug of black coffee steaming beside her laptop. She had spent hours crafting that email, choosing every word with the precision of a bomb maker. The goal was not to trigger an immediate investigation. She knew internal affairs would likely dismiss an anonymous tip. The goal was to create a small ripple on Kane's own turf, to generate a shockwave he could not ignore. It was a loyalty test for his department and a psychological trigger for him. The response was exactly what she had anticipated. Within hours, she watched the digital trail. Someone at the Charleston Police Department had searched Kane's name, cross-referencing it with his recent travel records and minor incident reports filed by airport police. They were trying to identify the recent incident. They had taken the bait for Garrett Kane. The problem began with a summons to the captain's office. Captain Briggs, a man with a politician's smile and a shark's eyes, called him in. The door was closed. That was never a good sign. "Garrett," Briggs began, leaning back in his chair, the picture of indifferent authority. "I got a strange email this morning. Anonymous. Sounded like one of our own venting." He slid a printout of Celeste's email across the desk. Kane's blood ran cold as he read it. The ambiguity of the wording was somehow more terrifying than a direct accusation. It suggested someone was watching. Someone knew more than they were saying. "Video evidence," Kane muttered, his mind flashing to the teenager with the phone. "What is this?" "That's what I'm asking you," Briggs said, the smile gone. "You go on a trip, and 2 days later, I get this in my inbox. Do you have something you need to tell me, Garrett? Because the last thing I need is the local news running a story about one of my guys throwing punches on a plane." Kane's mind spun. He could lie, deny everything, but the email was too specific. He opted for a version of the truth twisted to fit his narrative. "It was nothing, Captain. A drunk, disruptive passenger causing a scene. I calmed it down." "You mean you hit a woman?" Briggs asked in a flat voice. "She was aggressive," Kane insisted, raising his voice. "She put her hands on me first." It was a weak, instinctive lie, but it was all he had. Briggs sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, Garrett, I don't care what happened. What I care about is this email. It means someone is looking for trouble. So I'm telling you once, make this go away. I don't want to hear another word about it. No reports, no media. No lawsuits, understood?" Kane left the captain's office with a knot in his stomach. Make it go away. It was a familiar order. The official language of cops covering for one another. But this felt different. Briggs was not offering to protect him. He was warning him. The department did not see him as an asset to protect, but as a liability to contain. Paranoia began to take hold. Who had sent the email? A passenger? The flight attendant? An airport cop? He felt phantom eyes on him as he walked through the station. Friendly greetings from colleagues suddenly seemed forced, their smiles too tight. He was isolated, and the fear was rapidly transforming into rage. He was Officer Garrett Kane. Nobody hunted him. He was the one who hunted them. I made a decision. I was not going to wait for this to blow over. He was going to find the source of the problem, that woman from the plane, and he was going to intimidate her into silence. He was going to show her what happened when you messed with a real cop. He walked to his terminal, knuckles white, and began an illegal search of the flight manifest. He was falling directly into the second phase of Celeste's trap. The search was a flagrant abuse of power, but for Kane, it was just another Tuesday. He used his police credentials to access the airline's protected passenger list, a clear violation of federal privacy laws. He cross-referenced names with DMV photos until her face appeared on the screen. Celeste Voss. Address in Alexandria, Virginia. No criminal record. Impeccable. Too impeccable. To him, her clean history was not a sign of a law-abiding citizen. It was a red flag. It meant she was hiding something, that she was one of those people who thought they were better than him. He wrote down her address with a grim satisfaction washing over him. The fear was gone, replaced by the familiar, intoxicating adrenaline of the hunt. He was no longer the cornered prey. He was the wolf, and he was about to visit a lamb that had strayed too far from the flock. He did not tell his captain. He did not tell his partner. This was personal. He requested 2 days of personal leave, citing a family emergency, and drove the long stretch from Charleston to Alexandria. The entire way he rehearsed what he would say, how he would stand, how he would use his imposing presence to break her. He had done it hundreds of times. A whispered word in a dark parking lot, a slow drive past a house, a friendly chat that was anything but friendly. It always worked. People were cowards. They folded in the face of real power. Celeste was waiting. She had not been idle. She had been preparing the ground using FBI resources. She had flagged her name across every law enforcement database. The moment Kane performed the search, a silent alarm triggered on her terminal. She watched in real time as he illegally accessed her DMV record, her address, her entire life. It was a clear, prosecutable felony, and now she had the digital timestamp and IP address to prove it. She knew he was coming. Men like Kane could not help themselves. Their arrogance was a compass that always pointed them toward self-destruction. Her apartment, a modern, minimalist space in a high-security building, had been turned into a stage. A team from the FBI's Technical Surveillance Countermeasures Unit had swept the place. They installed 3 pinhole cameras so small they were practically invisible, each strategically positioned to capture a different angle of the living room. The audio recording equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of picking up a whisper across the room. She had sent her neighbors on an all-expenses-paid weekend trip, courtesy of an anonymous lottery win, ensuring no one would witness Kane's arrival. The trap was set. All she had to do was wait for the prey to walk into it. The knock on her door came with sharp authority. It was not a polite tap. It was the hard, demanding knock of a cop who expected the door to open. Celeste took a deep breath and checked the live feed on her phone. Kane was there, trying to look imposing in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. This time, she was not wearing the silk dress or makeup. She needed to look like a civilian, a victim. She opened the door with a carefully constructed expression, a mask of confusion and fear. "Yes?" Kane's lips curled into a mocking smile. He had expected this. The bravado from the plane was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed fear he was used to seeing. "Celeste Voss," he said, though he already knew the answer. "We need to talk." "Who are you?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. "You remember me," he said, stepping forward and forcing her to back into the apartment. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the silent room, a classic intimidation tactic. "Isolate the target." "What are you doing in my house?" Celeste asked, retreating toward the center of the living room, perfectly positioned in the camera's crosshairs. "I'm here for a friendly conversation," Kane said in a low, gravelly voice. He began to walk around the room, picking things up. A book, a photo frame, invading her space, establishing dominance. "I got a call from my captain. Seems someone sent a nasty email to my department, an anonymous email. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Celeste?" Celeste shook her head, eyes wide. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, slamming the book down on the coffee table. The noise made her flinch, a perfect, credible reaction. "I know it was you. You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you can ruin my career?" He was close now, standing over her, his shadow engulfing her. This was the moment to provoke him, to get him to say the words she needed. "I didn't do anything," she whispered, looking up at him. "You're the one who hit me." Kane let out an ugly, harsh laugh. "Oh, that was nothing. Just a little love tap. You have no idea what I'm capable of. You and your email. You made a serious mistake. People who mess with me tend to get hurt. Accidents happen all the time. I'm a fall down the stairs, faulty brakes. You understand what I'm saying?" It was more than she had ever hoped for. A direct threat. The confession of a pattern of behavior. Everything was being recorded, every incriminating syllable. Now the final piece. She looked him straight in the eyes, allowing a flicker of her true self to show. "Are you threatening me, Officer Kane?" The shift in her tone, the sudden absence of fear, threw him. He frowned. "Damn right I am," he growled, trying to regain control. "You're going to call my department. You're going to tell them you made it all up, that you were drunk and confused. And then you're going to forget my name, or I'll come back here and finish what I started on that plane. Understood?" I believed he was delivering the victory speech. He had no idea he had just signed his own confession. Celeste let the silence stretch, allowing his threats to fill the room, the hidden microphones absorbing every word. She held his gaze as her feigned fear slowly faded, replaced by the same unsettling calm she had shown on the plane. The transition was subtle, but absolute. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Kane noticed the change, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. The terrified victim had vanished. In her place stood someone he did not recognize, someone who was not reacting according to the script. "I think," Celeste said in a voice that was no longer a whisper, but a blade of cold steel. "That's perfectly clear." She took a deliberate step back, a measured movement that reclaimed the space he had tried to dominate. "You came to my home uninvited. You threatened my life. You admitted a pattern of intimidation. And you did it all after conducting an illegal search of my personal information using police resources." Each statement was like driving a nail into the coffin. Kane stared at her, his bravado faltering. This was not right. She was supposed to be crying, begging. "What the hell are you talking about?" he blustered, but the conviction had left his voice. "I'm talking about Title 18, Section 2261A of the U.S. Code," Celeste continued, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Stalking and witness tampering. Section 512. Both federal felonies. The illegal database search is another serious felony. Looks like you're collecting them. A genuine, cold, unfamiliar fear began to tighten in Kane's stomach. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a woman." "A woman," Celeste interrupted, taking a step toward him. The predator advancing. "Whom you assumed was defenseless, whom you thought you could hit and intimidate into silence. Just like the other 14 people who filed complaints against you. Did you really think I was just another name that would get buried in an internal affairs file?" The mention of the 14 complaints hit him like a physical blow. How could she know that? That information was sealed, protected. He went pale. "Who are you?" he finally stammered, his voice thick with growing horror. Celeste offered a slight, cold smile that never reached her eyes. "Let's just say I'm a concerned citizen with a personal interest in holding corrupt cops accountable." Kane's mind raced, trying to process a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond his control. He had walked in holding all the cards, and now found himself in the middle of a minefield. His cop instinct, the one that had been warning him something was wrong, was now screaming like sirens. This was a trap. The apartment, her calm, the precision of her accusations. Everything was a trap. He needed to leave. "I'm done here," he growled, turning toward the door. "No," Celeste said in a cutting tone. "I don't think you are." He froze with his hand on the doorknob. "You see, Garrett, I can call you Garrett, right? We're well past professional courtesy. I have this conversation recorded. Every threat, every confession. The high-definition video is a nice touch, too. The smoke detector camera catches the rage in your eyes perfectly." Kane spun around, his face contorted with disbelief and fury. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the cameras he now knew were there, feeling naked and exposed. "You," he whispered, his voice venomous. "You set me up." "You set yourself up," Celeste corrected calmly. "I just opened the door. Your arrogance did the rest. You couldn't help yourself, could you? You had to come. You had to prove you were in charge. And by doing so, you handed me your career on a silver platter." He took a step toward her, fists clenched. His last resort. Brute force. "I'll kill you, and I'll go down for murder instead of just assault and obstruction." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "That seems like a poor strategy. Besides, my entire team is monitoring this feed live. They know you're here. If my vital signs drop, this apartment will be filled with federal agents before you even reach the hallway." The absolute certainty in her voice finally broke him. The rage drained away, replaced by the nauseating sensation of total defeat. He looked at her, really looked at her, and did not see a woman. He saw a force of nature he had been foolish enough to challenge. He was ruined. He had confessed to multiple serious felonies on tape. His career, his pension, his freedom, everything was gone. He had entered this apartment a wolf and would leave it a statistic. "Now," Celeste said in a definitive tone, like a judge about to pronounce sentence, "get out of my house." Kane staggered backward, suddenly feeling heavy and uncoordinated. He fumbled for the doorknob, yanked the door open, and practically fell into the hallway. He did not look back. He simply ran. Celeste walked to the door and closed it softly. She leaned against it for a moment as the adrenaline began to ebb, then walked to her laptop where the recording was already uploading to a secure FBI server. The file name was simple. Kane Confession. MP4. The scalpel had done its work. Now it was time for the hammer. The next morning, Celeste walked into Deputy Director Reeves's office and placed a small encrypted hard drive on his desk. She did not need to say a word. The grim satisfaction on her face, contrasting with the fading bruise on her cheek, said everything. He connected the drive to his secure terminal, put on headphones, and for the next stretch of time, watched the unedited recording from her apartment. He saw Kane's arrogance, his invasion of her personal space, his escalating threats. He heard the confession, the arrogance, the absolute lack of remorse. When the video ended with Kane fleeing in panic, Reeves slowly removed the headphones and looked at Celeste with an expression that mixed fury and professional admiration. "Jesus Christ, Celeste," he said quietly. He hung himself. "He's a predator who's been protected by his own department for more than a decade," Celeste said in a flat voice. "He thought I was just another civilian he could intimidate into submission." The recording doesn't just prove witness tampering and stalking. It establishes a clear pattern of criminal intimidation that corroborates his entire complaint history. Reeves swiveled in his chair, staring at the seal of the United States on the wall behind him. The decision he was about to make would have significant repercussions. Launching a full-scale federal investigation against a decorated officer from another city's police department was a declaration of war against that department. It was a politically delicate matter that would inevitably generate friction between local and federal law enforcement. But the evidence was irrefutable. More than that, the target of the threats was a federal agent. Kane had not merely crossed a line. He had attacked the agency itself. "The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Virginia will take the case," Reeves declared. "Decision made. I want a comprehensive investigation. I want his finances, his call records, his departmental emails. I want every officer he's ever worked with interviewed, and every victim who's ever filed a complaint against him. We're not just going after Kane for what he did to you. We're going to dismantle his entire support network, offer immunity to any of his colleagues willing to testify about the cover-ups." The full power of the FBI was now in motion. It was a terrifyingly efficient machine. Within hours, a team of agents was assembled. Subpoenas were drafted. A federal judge signed the warrants. A case that had begun with a single punch on a plan began to expand into a complex investigation worthy of the RICO statutes. Celeste was officially designated lead consultant on the case. Her deep knowledge of Kane's psychology was considered an invaluable resource, but her primary role now was that of star witness. The first official act was a formal notification delivered to the chief of the Charleston Police Department. It was not a friendly phone call. It was a cold procedural notice informing him that one of his officers, Garrett Kane, was the subject of a federal criminal investigation for witness tampering, stalking, illegal use of police databases, and civil rights violations. The Charleston police chief, a man who had spent his career navigating the complexities of politics, immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. This was no longer an internal affairs matter. The FBI was involved. That meant the blue wall of silence was about to be breached by a battering ram. For Kane, the first sign that his world was ending did not come with a knock on the door, but with a panicked call from his union representative. "Garrett, what the hell did you do?" The representative's voice cracked over the phone. "The feds are here. They're coming with a warrant for your personnel file, your locker, everything." Kane was at home, trying to drown the memory of the confrontation at Celeste's apartment in alcohol. He had been convincing himself it was a bluff, that she had nothing. The phone call shattered that illusion. It was real. All of it. An hour later, two of his own fellow officers, men he had known for years, appeared at his door. They would not look him in the eye. One of them handed him a piece of paper. "Garrett, by order of the chief, you're on administrative leave effective immediately," the officer muttered, reading from a script. "You need to surrender your badge and service weapon." The words hit him harder than any punch from Celeste. His badge, his gun. They were the source of his identity, the symbols of his power. Without them, he was just a man who had made a very powerful enemy. With a trembling hand, he unclipped the badge from his belt and handed it over. Then he opened his safe and surrendered his Glock. The metal was cold, inert. As his colleagues turned to leave, one of them paused at the door. "They say it was a woman, Garrett," he said quietly. "You picked the wrong one." The door closed, leaving Kane alone in his house, stripped of his power, his identity, and his protection. The system he had served, the system he had used and abused throughout his career, had abandoned him. He was alone, and he knew with a sickening certainty that the FBI was coming for him. Administrative leave was only the beginning of a slow, crushing isolation. Kane had always lived inside a bubble of assumed invincibility, a bubble maintained by the unspoken police code. Cops protected each other. That was the first rule. But he soon discovered the rule had a corollary. Cops protected each other until one of them became a threat to the entire institution. And with the FBI watching the Charleston Police Department closely, Kane had become toxic. His partner of 5 years, a man with whom he had shared countless hours in a patrol car, suddenly stopped answering his calls. The colleagues he drank with after work saw him coming and abruptly left. The station, once his kingdom, was now foreign territory. He was an outcast, a pariah. The federal investigation advanced with astonishing speed and precision. FBI agents in their signature dark suits became a regular presence at the Charleston station. They were polite, professional, and relentless. They interviewed dozens of officers, asking pointed questions about Kane's conduct, his temper, and any off-the-books incidents that might not have made it into official reports. They offered deals, whispered promises of immunity in exchange for testimony. The blue wall of silence, which had seemed so impenetrable, began to crack under the pressure. Kane, confined to his house, could only watch from afar as his life was dissected. His bank records were subpoenaed. His phone records were scrutinized. The feds were building a case brick by brick, and he was powerless to stop it. The paranoia that had begun in the captain's office was now a permanent state. He felt constantly under surveillance. Every car that drove slowly past his street was a potential FBI agent. Every click on his phone was a sign of a wiretap. He began to drink heavily, but the whiskey barely dulled the growing dread. He sat in his darkened living room with the letter of suspension and the federal investigation notice on the coffee table and simply stared at the walls. He replayed the confrontation in Celeste's apartment over and over in his mind. He saw her cold, serene eyes. He heard her dissecting his crimes with surgical precision. Who was she? He had searched her name in every private database he could access, through shady contacts, and found nothing. Only a clean, sterile file. The absence of information was more terrifying than a lengthy police report. It meant she was a professional, a ghost. The deepest betrayal came from his own department. Captain Briggs, the man who had ordered him to make it disappear, was the first to cooperate with the FBI. Facing a federal charge of obstruction of justice for failing to properly investigate the initial incident on the plane, Briggs gave a sworn statement to the agents. He told them Kane had admitted to a confrontation, that he had ordered him to handle it, and that Kane had a known history of being impulsive. He sacrificed Kane to save his own career, a calculated act of self-preservation that left Kane unofficially without departmental protection. The news reached Kane through a leak from one of the few officers still willing to speak to him. The betrayal hurt more than the investigation itself. He had always believed in the inviolability of the thin, blue line. He had covered for other cops, broken rules, looked the other way, always expecting them to do the same for him. Now they were lining up to testify against him. Celeste monitored the process from her office in Washington. She received daily reports from the investigative team, read interview transcripts, and watched the evidence accumulate. She saw Kane's support system crumble exactly as she had predicted. His arrogance had been built on institutional protection. Now that the foundation was gone, he was in freefall. She felt a cold, grim satisfaction, not joy, but the quiet, methodical pleasure of a strategist watching a complex plan materialize. Kane had lost his friends, his job, and his identity. The only thing left was his freedom, and that was the next thing she would take from him. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place when the teenager from the plane, located by the FBI, turned over the video he had recorded. It was crystal clear. It showed Kane's aggression, Celeste's serene refusal, and the brutal, unprovoked punch. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was the visual proof that would corroborate every word of Celeste's testimony. The U.S. attorney reviewed the video, Captain Briggs's signed confession, and the mountain of evidence from the FBI investigation. It was one of the strongest cases he had ever seen. He picked up the phone and gave the order everyone had been waiting for. Go get him. The arrest was designed for maximum impact. It was not a discreet request for surrender or a quiet dawn visit. It was a public spectacle, a staged demonstration meant to send a message to every corrupt cop in the city. On a bright morning, a convoy of black SUVs with federal plates rolled down the quiet residential street where Garrett Kane lived. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, their morning routines interrupted by the sudden, imposing display of federal power. 12 FBI agents in tactical vests with the bold yellow letters FBI stepped out of the vehicles. They moved with a synchronized, determined silence, far more intimidating than any siren. They formed a perimeter around Kane's house, while 2 lead agents approached up the driveway. Kane saw them coming. He had been waiting for days. His life had shrunk to the 4 walls of his house, waiting for the inevitable. The fear that had been a slow poison was now a heart attack. He was standing in his kitchen with a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter when the hard, authoritative knock sounded on the door. FBI, open the door! He stood frozen for a moment, his mind refusing to accept reality. Then the command came again, louder, followed by the sound of a battering ram being prepared. He staggered to the door and opened it. Facing him were 2 agents, a man and a woman, with serious, professional faces. The lead agent, a tall man with piercing blue eyes, held up an arrest warrant. Garrett Kane, he said in a flat, emotionless voice. You are under arrest for violations of federal law, including witness tampering, stalking, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The formal language, the cold enumeration of his crimes, made it brutally real. This was not a misunderstanding. This was the end. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. Kane hesitated, a flicker of his old defiance rising. For a second, he thought about resisting, about fighting. But a look at the 12 agents surrounding his property, at the cold, hard certainty in their eyes, extinguished that thought. He was outnumbered and outmatched. He turned slowly, with an awkward, surreal movement, and placed his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs rang out deafeningly in the morning air. The cold steel bit into his wrists, a sensation he had inflicted on countless people, but had never imagined experiencing himself. It was the ultimate symbol of his powerlessness. The agents led him out of his house, down the driveway, in full view of his astonished neighbors. Mrs. Henderson across the street, the woman he sometimes nodded to when collecting the mail, stood on her porch with her hand over her mouth. The kids who used to play basketball in the cul-de-sac fell silent, watching. He was being displayed like a captured animal. His humiliation was total. They put him in the back of one of the SUVs, and the door slammed shut with a final thud. As the convoy pulled away, Kane looked out the window at the life he was leaving behind. The immaculate lawns, the identical houses, the illusion of respectability. It was all gone. He had spent his entire career on the other side of that steel cage, in the front of a patrol car. Now he was on this side. And Celeste was not there to see it, but she was watching the feed from a drone discreetly circling the area. The video streamed direct to her secure terminal in the Hoover building. She watched as the man who had assaulted her, threatened her, and underestimated her was led away in handcuffs. She felt a flicker of something, not triumph, but a cold, hard sense of completion. It was the feeling of a long, complex equation finally resolving. The public repercussions were immediate. The U.S. Attorney's Office held a press conference that afternoon. They announced the arrest of Officer Garrett Kane and detailed the charges. They mentioned a brave victim who had come forward and an ongoing investigation into the practices of the Charleston Police Department. Local news channels ran the story. Kane's face appeared on every screen, his gaunt, defeated mugshot, a stark contrast to the confident officer he had once been. The narrative was written. He was not a hero cop. He was a criminal who had hidden behind a badge. The arrest was the physical manifestation of his fall. They had taken his gun, his budge, and his brotherhood. Now they had taken his freedom. The only thing left to take was his time. And that would happen in a courtroom where his final and most formidable victim waited to testify against him. The trial of the United States versus Garrett Kane became the most talked about legal battle in the state. The federal courtroom filled daily with a tense mixture of journalists, police accountability activists, curious neighbors, and a handful of off-duty officers who watched the proceedings with serious, guarded expressions. The anticipation was palpable. This was not merely about one cop's crimes. It was a referendum on a system that had protected him for too long. Kane sat at the defense table, a shadow of his former self. He had lost weight, and his ill-fitting suit seemed to hang on his frame. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, latent resentment. His defense attorney, a expensive lawyer paid for by the police union's last act of loyalty, argued that Kane was a dedicated officer, the victim of a personal vendetta, targeted by an overzealous federal government. It was a narrative that began to collapse from the first day. The prosecution, led by the sharp and relentless assistant, U.S. Attorney Elena Vargas, began by building a foundation on the character of the witnesses, or the lack thereof. She did not call Celeste first. Instead, she called the passengers and crew of the flight one by one. They took the stand and recounted the events of that day. Marla, the flight attendant, described Kane's aggressive, demanding behavior from the moment he boarded. Her voice trembled as she recalled the sound of the punch. "I've never seen anything like it," she told the jury. It was pure, unprovoked violence. The man from seat 3A, a software executive named Elias Quinn, testified next. He described Kane's belligerence and Celeste's serene refusal. "She never raised her voice. She never made any threatening move," Quinn stated, looking directly at the jury. He was the aggressor from start to finish. He hit her because his pride was hurt. That's all. The most impactful testimony of the day came from the teenager who had recorded the incident. Mateo Reyes, a 17-year-old, who was nervous but resolute, authenticated the video as the prosecutor played it for the jury on a large screen. The courtroom fell silent as they watched the scene. They saw Kane leaning over the seated Celeste. They heard his gritted demand, "Last chance, move." They saw Celeste's quiet, simple no. And then they saw the fist. The video showed the raw truth, demolishing any defense Kane's attorney had tried to construct. A murmur of shock ran through the room. Several jurors flinched. The video ended, but the image lingered, an indelible stain. During cross-examination, Kane's attorney attempted to discredit the witnesses. He suggested Marla was exaggerating, that Elias Quinn was seeking his 15 minutes of fame, and that Mateo Reyes's video lacked full context. But the tactic backfired. The witnesses held firm with consistent, unshakable accounts. Their testimony painted a vivid, damning portrait of a man with a dangerous sense of superiority and a violent temper. Vargas then proceeded to establish Kane's pattern of behavior. She called 2 of the 14 previous victims who had filed complaints against him. An elderly African-American man Kane had brutally arrested for loitering on his own porch, and a young woman he had stopped and terrorized during a traffic stop. Their stories were chilling and heartbreakingly similar to Celeste's. They spoke of Kane's immediate aggression, his refusal to listen, and the physical violence that followed any attempt at defiance. For the first time, their complaints were not being dismissed in an internal affairs office. They were being heard under oath in a federal courtroom. It was a day of powerful, emotional testimony that left Kane visibly smaller and more isolated at the defense table. The jury was no longer looking at a single incident on a plane. They were seeing the scale of a man who had used his badge as a license for brutality for more than a decade. The foundation was set. Vargas had shown the jury who Garrett Kane was. It was time for the woman who would lock him away for good. At the end of the day's session, Vargas addressed her team. "Tomorrow," she said in a low, confident voice, "we put Special Agent Voss on the stand. Tomorrow, this ends." The day Celeste took the stand, there was not a single empty seat in the courtroom. A palpable murmur filled the air. She was the woman at the center of it all, the catalyst for Kane's spectacular fall. When she was called, she walked to the stand with deliberate calm and elegance. She wore a simple navy suit, a marked contrast to the silk dress she had worn during the assault. Her face remained impassive. Her bruised lip had completely healed, leaving no trace of the violence. She took the oath in the clear, firm voice and sat with her gaze fixed on the prosecutor. Elena Vargas did not look at Garrett Kane. She began by carefully establishing Celeste's background, demonstrating her credibility and her long, distinguished career with the FBI. Then she moved to the day of the flight, and Celeste recounted it with chilling, factual precision. She described Kane's attitude, his demands, her refusal, and the assault itself. She spoke without any emotion. Her testimony, a cold, hard enumeration of the facts, made the violence seem even more shocking. "He hit me," she stated simply, "because I said no. He did not see me as a person. He saw me as an obstacle to what he wanted." Kane's attorney began his cross-examination with a sneer of disdain. His strategy was clear. Present Celeste as a manipulative, vengeful woman, an arrogant federal agent who had set a trap for Kane. "Special Agent Voss," he began, in a voice dripping with condescension. "You are a highly trained federal agent, are you not? Expert in hand-to-hand combat, deception, and psychological manipulation." "I am trained to handle threats to national security," Celeste answered in an even tone. "And would you say you felt threatened by my client, Officer Kane?" "I recognized his behavior as a potential threat, yes." "Aha!" the attorney exclaimed, turning to the jury. "So you, a trained combatant, felt threatened because a police officer asked you to change seats. I was not acting as an agent on that flight. Celeste corrected coldly. I was a citizen being harassed and subsequently assaulted. My training has nothing to do with the fact that your client committed a crime. The attorney attempted to rattle her by twisting her words and questioning her motives, but it was like throwing stones at a fortress. Celeste remained unflappable. Her answers were concise, direct, and devastatingly effective. She never lost her composure, never gave him the emotional reaction he was desperately trying to provoke. After a frustrating hour, he finally gave up. No further questions. Vargas rose again. Your Honor, the prosecution has one final piece of evidence. A wave of anticipation swept the room. We would like to play for the court a recording made at Special Agent Voss's residence 2 days after the assault. Kane stiffened. His face, which until then had been a mask of sullen boredom, went pale. He knew what was coming. The court clerk dimmed the lights, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. The video from the hidden camera in Celeste's smoke detector filled the screen. The jury watched Kane barge into the apartment. They watched him threaten Celeste. They heard his voice, clear as water, issuing threats. You have no idea what I'm capable of. People who mess with me tend to get hurt. Accidents happen all the time. The silence in the courtroom was sepulchral. Everyone strained to hear every damning word. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, faces reflecting a mixture of shock and disgust. They watched Kane threaten to finish what he had started on that plane. They heard him, in his own voice, confess to a lifetime of intimidation, believing he was terrorizing a helpless victim. When the recording ended with him discovering the trap and fleeing the apartment, the screen went dark, but the silence that remained was dense and absolute. It was the sound of a man's life coming to an end. Vargas let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. There was nothing more to say. The recording was the irrefutable proof. Kane's own voice, his own arrogance, had been the final witness against him. He collapsed into his chair, a defeated man, avoiding the horrified, condemning stares of the 12 jurors who now held his fate in their hands. Finally, he looked at Celeste. She held his gaze for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, her dark eyes as cold and deep as a winter lake. In that instant, he understood. He had not been in a fight. He had been executed. The jury's deliberation was a mere formality. They were out of the courtroom for less than 45 minutes, a clear signal of a swift, unanimous decision. When they returned to the box, their faces were grim and resolved. None of them looked at Garrett Kane. He sat at the defense table staring straight ahead, his hands clenched so tightly on the table that his knuckles were white. The life had drained from his face, leaving behind a gray, waxy expression. He looked like a man already in his own coffin. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreman and handed it to the judge. The judge, an experienced jurist with a reputation for being severe but fair, read the verdict to himself with an impassive expression, then returned the form to the clerk. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, the clerk read, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom, we the jury find the defendant, Garrett Kane, guilty. A muffled gasp ran through the gallery. Kane flinched as if struck again. On the charge of witness tampering, the jury finds the defendant, Garrett Kane, guilty. Kane closed his eyes. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, an empty gesture of comfort. On the charge of stalking, the jury finds the defendant, Garrett Kane, guilty. The litany of his crimes, each sealed with the word guilty, was a drumbeat announcing the end of his life as he knew it. When the clerk finished, the judge cleared his throat and addressed the room. He looked down from the bench, not at the lawyers, but directly at Kane. "Mr. Kane, would you please stand?" Kane rose with effort, his movements stiff and mechanical. "For 12 years, the judge began in a cold, cutting voice, you carried a badge that represents trust, honor, and the commitment to protect the public. You swore to uphold the law. Yet the evidence presented to this court demonstrates that you were a man who believed himself above the law. You used your authority not to protect, but to harass, intimidate, and abuse. You were a predator, hiding in plain sight, protected by a system you manipulated, and a code of silence you exploited." The judge paused, letting the words hang in the air. Your assault on Special Agent Voss was not an aberration. It was the inevitable result of 12 years of unchecked arrogance and violence. What you failed to understand is that the badge is not a crown, and the authority it confers is not absolute. Today, that authority ends. He picked up the gavel. "Given the severity of your crimes, the brazen attempt to intimidate a federal witness, and your complete lack of remorse, this court sentences you, Garrett Kane, to 7 years in federal prison." A murmur of astonishment ran through the room. 7 years. It was a severe sentence, a clear message. The marshals took positions behind Kane, hands ready. He swayed slightly, his face contorted with disbelief. He looked at Celeste one last time with a desperate, pleading gaze, as if searching for an answer, a reason. Celeste held his gaze, and for the first time allowed a flicker of something to cross her face. It was not pity. It was not triumph. It was nothing. I was irrelevant. A problem solved. A case closed. The marshal took his arm and led him away. He offered no resistance. The fight was over. As they took him from the courtroom, beginning a new chapter of his life, marked by disgrace and incarceration, Celeste rose and walked out into the hallway, indifferent to the bustle of reporters and the flash of cameras. It was finished. Justice had been done, cold and methodical. Weeks later, Celeste stood on the balcony of her apartment. The cool night breeze was a comforting balm. The lights of Alexandria stretched before her like a web of scattered diamonds. The noise of the trial had faded. The media had moved on to the next scandal, and the world kept turning. In Charleston, the police department was in chaos, dismantled by a federal oversight committee created after Kane's conviction. Real, painful, slow change was beginning to take root. Garrett Kane was now just a number in a federal penitentiary, stripped of his name, his badge, and his power. The scales had been balanced. It was not a victory that provoked cheers or celebrations. It was a quiet, profound sense of order restored. She had not acted out of pure vengeance, but from a deeper, more rooted principle. That power without accountability is tyranny, and that the shield of a badge must never become a sword. Men like Kane thrived in the shadows of public indifference and institutional silence. She had simply shone a light so bright, he had nowhere left to hide. He had destroyed himself. She had merely provided the stage and the script. And for the 14 previous victims, for every person who had ever been harassed by a police officer, a little justice had finally been done. What do you believe is the difference between justice and revenge? Did Celeste do the right thing by setting a trap? Or should she have followed official channels from the beginning? Leave your opinion in the comments, and thank you for joining me on this journey.